Dr. Joanne Yoong is an applied microeconomist and interdisciplinary researcher working on consumer and household decision-making in vulnerable populations. She holds multiple faculty appointments and is the author of over 80 peer-reviewed articles in leading economics, medical, and public health journals. She's also worked on projects all around the world, including Singapore, US, India, China, Ghana, Kenya, Cambodia, Indonesia, and Iraqi Kurdistan. Basically, you name it, she's got it, all right? So without further delay, I'd like to invite Dr. Joanne Yoong, the lead researcher, to share more about this paper. Dr. Joanne Yoong, please.
Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me? Terrific. Thank you, Felicia, for that warm welcome. And I want to again thank Octava Foundation for the opportunity to work on this important topic. I also want to acknowledge the rest of our research team that have done such a great job putting this together. As you will see, this was a multidisciplinary effort. And I also want to thank one of our great collaborators in this room, Adam Gerard from Columba Design, that helped us to put this thing together in a way that would be impactful in terms of communications as well. So it's been a real team effort in putting this piece of research out into the world. And thank you all so much for coming to listen to the webinar today. So as Felicia mentioned, this report or this white paper is really about activating change around what we know to be one of the most, I think, compelling things about the Singapore education system, that it is a system that is the pride of Singapore, quite rightfully, around the world. But in our desire to improve and our desire to lead the world, we also want to make sure that the people who are most vulnerable in our populations are not left behind. And so one of the things that we wanted to interrogate with this report is really to understand, as we celebrate, quite rightfully, the accomplishments of the Singapore education, what do we know about some of the ways in which we could also move it forward, focusing specifically on issues related to equity. And the key question that Octava Foundation wanted to address, both in thinking about understanding the landscape better as a stakeholder, but also in thinking about ways to intervene, is really what approaches focusing on children at the primary school age are likely to be most effective in addressing possible socioeconomic disadvantage in education within, again, the Singapore context specifically. So what we did to get this research agenda off the ground, and this was a piece of work that we undertook over a period of about 18 months, very recently, was threefold. The first thing that we wanted to ask ourselves is to ask whether or not the socioeconomic status-related disadvantage gap in education in Singapore is something that we could quantify. When does it appear? Is it something that we see at the end of primary school, in mid-primary school, and even before primary school? What do we know about what might drive this gap? And what do we really know about the implications of this gap? And so what we wanted to do was really start by taking a good look at the evidence that we have to hand to try to understand as far as we can the magnitude and characteristics of this issue before we start asking ourselves, what can we do to problem solve? Having done that, the second piece of this research then went forward to say, what can we really learn from best practices in global settings? And again, understanding that this is an issue that not only Singapore faces, and educational equity is a global concern. We went forward to look in a very pragmatic way at the global evidence base for interventions in primary school. And we were very specific here, which is that we wanted to look at interventions for children at risk from socioeconomic status-related factors, but in settings that would be comparable to Singapore. And we wanted to do this in a way that was rigorous and evidence-based, but also pragmatic, relevant, and in some sense would be directly answering some of the practice questions that would be uncovered by initial literature scan. And the third thing that we want to do then, after having looked at the global evidence base, is to then take a step very far forward in grounding this into the local context and to say, well, we've learned something about what we know about the landscape, we've learned something about global best practice, but what do we know about what we think will work here in Singapore? And so we took both our evidence scan and what we knew from the local landscape. And what we did was go through a round of consultations with local stakeholders, both from the public and private sector, from the educational research sector and the practice sector, to try to ask three really important questions. Can we validate these findings with you? Do they make sense? Second, how can we build interventions around these findings that would work for Singapore, and what do we know about implementation factors unique to our Singapore setting that we should take into account? And last but not least, as we move forward, thinking about dialogue in the sector that can help on a long-term basis sustain these kinds of conversations, what are some common factors that we need to build into those discussions to make sure that we start this ball rolling and we keep it going as well? So I'm going to be speaking about all three of these pieces, and I'm hoping very much that we have left a significant amount of time for question and answer. And so what would be wonderful is if that dialogue can start here with all of you today. So I'm going to start first by talking a little bit about the local evidence review. And I want to give a little bit of context to the way that we conducted the evidence review. And what we wanted to do was make sure that we covered as far as possible all the evidence that we could find from published peer-reviewed literature relevant to Singapore, white papers, data sets, and basically what we would consider to be the gray literature that gave us some quantitative understanding of the socio-economic status gap in the local population of children of primary school age. We wanted to restrict ourselves to publicly available information so that this would be an evidence review that all stakeholders could use to move discussion forward. And I will also be discussing a little bit about other pieces of data that we came across and did primary analysis on, but we won't be presenting today. So the first and most important grounding actually for this piece of work, but also for the report as a whole, is to understand that capturing socioeconomic status is not straightforward. And there are many definitions of socioeconomic status, but at its broadest, I think this definition by Cohen and co-authors was done actually as and it's quite a fundamental definition in this space. It was a part of a definitional exercise conducted for the National Assessment of Educational Progress. And this definition actually lays it out, I think, really very clearly. A socioeconomic status is defined broadly as access to financial, social, cultural, and human capital resources. And what that means is that when we look at the literature, not just in education, but really across health, social programs, we find that very narrow definitions of SES have related to simply the financial aspect of this, or the material and structural factors captured by what we call the big three: education, occupation, and household income. And part of this is not just because conceptually we have always really focused on these material aspects of the question, but also because these are often the most clearly and most tangibly straightforward things to measure. But in fact, when we look actually and we take a step back towards this broader definition of SES, expanded measures in the literature actually typically reflect efforts to really engage with this definition in three very meaningful ways. And one is that we see more levels of access than one's own individual or one's own family's economic status. So we'll see that, for example, you might see measures of community or neighborhood level wealth, because we understand that this reflects networks and assets that actually also support one's own socioeconomic status. Secondly, we see broader dimensions. So, for example, we might see that this reflects not just wealth, but actually family status, social class. So indications of standing or hierarchy within a community that might not be related to economic well-being alone, but are related to more social markers. And then last but not least, as again, if we take this in broader context, it's very clear that when we talk about resources, we also have to ask ourselves, resources for what? So at the end of the day, when we think about those resources, definitions of SES actually can vary depending on the purpose in which we're performing an analysis. So we might think about context-specific assets or resources depending on what we're going to be embedding that definition of SES in. So, for example, in the area of educational equity, definitions of socioeconomic status actually are very, very broad, because we understand that this definition of financial, social, cultural, and human capital resources relevant to education and educational attainment has to necessarily be more holistic than material and structural factors. And so when we look at an international program, like the Program for International Student Assessment, or PISA, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with, what they use as a measure of SES is actually what they consider to be a measure of economic, social, and cultural status. And this is a composite index, which includes the big three. So parental education, parental occupation actually doesn't include income, because income is very challenging to measure on an international standard. But it also includes general household assets that reflect typically wealth, such as possession of a car, but as well, it includes assets that reflect a family's ability to provide an environment for learning. And this includes a room or just a table for the child to work, access to the internet, the number of books in the household, and other educational resources. And so that index is very well reflected in the PISA assessments, and is used across countries to reflect whether or not actually we find that students have SES related to educational attainment. And in Singapore, what we see again are that when we look at the literature in Singapore, we see a very wide range again of definitions of SES, but very commonly we also see proxy measures. For example, in Singapore, it's very common for us to see SES reflected by housing type, whether you live in a rental home, whether you live in public housing and how many rooms, or whether you live in a condominium or a landed property. And this also reflects a wide socio-economic spectrum. Or the area of students, very often we use qualifying for the financial assistance scheme as a shortcut. And this from, in 2023 will mean that there's a gross monthly income or a per capita income cut off for students that are at that low end of the earnings spectrum. So what that means for us, one second, just going to try to, it's really that when we look at socioeconomic status in the literature, but also conceptually, there's a very wide range of markers that lead us to this very holistic understanding of SES. And when we undertook this study, what we wanted to do was make sure that we didn't restrict ourselves a priori to one or the other. And so when we undertook the local evidence review, we really wanted to look across all of these markers to see if we could find studies or data that reflected any one of these upfront. And then we consolidate them later when we did our discussion. And what we found was actually quite surprisingly that, in fact, there is a diversity of indicators, but there's also not a huge amount of data or information, even when we look at the whole. If we want to answer the question, first of all, and upfront, let's start right up front with this, right? Do we see effects divided by socioeconomic status in primary school? The answer is yes. Right. So in June 2021, a parliamentary question was raised to ask the Minister of Education what the median T-scores of students were in the PSLE. And the response was that MOE does not really collect data on the household income of students, except for Singapore citizen students who apply for the FAS. But it was very transparently reported in response what that median T-score is by these two markers. And so what you can see is the entire cohort of PSLE students from the year 2012 to 2020. This is before the new PSLE score recalibration. The entire cohort has a median T-score of just above 200, but students on the FAS are significantly lower. And what was also reported was that the median PSLE T-score of the entire PSLE cohort was around 207 versus around 160 plus for the FAS students, and that this trend has remained stable for about a decade. New information based on the new bandings are not yet available. And so there is a clear disparity. What we wanted to ask then was that, do we see if there's any evidence that there are SES effects in mid-primary? And for this, quantitative information is actually remarkably sparse. But what's actually very fascinating is that we do have some very interesting information from the Trends in International Mathematics and Science study. Now, the TIMSS study, for those of you who are familiar with PISA, is very similar. It's a global assessment that's organized internationally. It uses a nationally representative sample of students from the age of 9 to 10. And what it does is it provides an international benchmark of student knowledge and skills in mathematics and science, student attitudes towards learning, as well as student demographics. And it allows for a computation of an SES index that is comparable to the PISA index. And Singapore has been a participant in the TIMSS for many, many years. And what I think is actually really very fascinating is that the information from the TIMSS actually reflects a lot about what we know in general about the way the Singapore education system works. So you can see here in blue, this is the official statement from the Ministry of Education on the latest TIMSS data from 2019. And Singapore outperforms in absolute terms. There is no doubt about it. We have one of the highest proportion of students who perform extremely well, that is achieving advanced to a high benchmarks among participating education systems. The number of Singaporean students who do not pass the lowest benchmark, is very, very small. So virtually all of our students at primary 4 actually pass international standards for their age. And this is remarkable on a global level. Now, what's interesting, again, is that all our students, as you see reflected here, do very well by international standards, not just those who are strong, not just those we're all passing the bar. And students who are academically weaker still do well across all participating systems. Now, that's the good news, is that on an absolute level, we are outperforming. However, if we look at data from the TIMSS that has been collated by TIMSS and reported by socio-economic status, what we'll see is that when we step back and we look at SES and we look at achievement at an intermediate level, we start to see disparities emerge. So firstly, what you can see here on this bar chart is the percentage of students in the low SES quintile computed by TIMSS. And what you can see is that the percentage of low SES students achieving the intermediate benchmark is actually, first of all, declining and then rising again over time. So when we look at students that are at a moderate level, this level of universality decreases. But more importantly, for our purposes, if you look at the two lines here, what you'll see is that the gray line is the average mathematics score for high SES student, and the black line is the average mathematics score for low SES students. And what you see here is a gap. And this gap is small, but actually increases over the decade leading up to 2007, and then decreases again, but remains larger than it was in 1995. And this was actually remarked upon by TIMSS itself, which said that, among all of the countries in the world, this is actually quite striking, because in many countries, we do see that this gap between low and high SES is stable or closing, but it does seem that in Singapore, this kind of stability or actually shutting of the gap is not quite evident in the data for primary students in math and science. So this is very striking for us in terms of SES effect, because this is right in the middle of our primary school experience in two of the areas that are very critically important for the Singapore education system. The last piece of secondary data that I'd like to share with you are our understanding of whether or not this begins happening in the pre-primary years. And what's actually been very enriching for us in this space is the emergence of large-scale, highly robust scientific studies of early childhood in the Singapore context, one of which is the Singapore LEADS study, SG LEADS, which is led out of NUS. So SG LEADS is supported by the NUS Center for Family and Population Research. It follows 5,000 children and primary caregivers representing Singapore residents with children under 7. And this study, led by Joanne Yoong and her collaborators, really has examined almost every aspect of the early development of these young children over time. And one of the most fascinating early deliverables of SG LEADS is really looking at both the achievement and socio-emotional skills among this cohort of children. And what they have found is that socioeconomic status, here defined by household income, and also by household income, and also by the education level of parents, is actually very strongly related to age-appropriate numeracy and verbal tests, as well as, very importantly, delay of gratification. And so the kind of future orientation and social-emotional abilities that are associated, as we know, with learning achievement later on show a strong and robust correlation with socioeconomic status indicators. And in the case of delayed gratification scores, this gradient starts to emerge in nursery and is consistent through kindergarten and persists in early primary school. And so it suggests here that the roots of this gradient that we're seeing in mid-primary, that they manifest at the PSLE, start even before children enter primary. The second data set that I just want to raise up here is the Growing Up in Singapore Towards Healthier Outcomes study, or the GUSTO study, which is run out of NUS Medicine and Kanakaba Hospital. And this is a birth cohort of 1,200 Singaporean women who were studied actually pre-conception. and followed after they gave birth for several years as well. And the findings from Gusto also echo the findings from SG Leads. It shows that achievement and social-emotional skills are associated with SES even before primary. So in the Gusto study, we've seen preschool-age children in the lowest income groups scoring lower on measures of pre-academic achievement. These are slightly different measures because this is a much more clinically oriented study, but we can see that when we look at measures of fluency, general knowledge, vocabulary, phonics for children in the low-income group, there is a clear gap between their achievement and children in the highest income group. They're also more likely to report behavioral or social-emotional programs, even at this early stage, or working memory issues. But I think what really is the incredible takeaway of studies like SG Lead and Gusto is the fact that these are not single outcome studies, but really rich studies of a longitudinal experience of children and their families. And this allows to tell us a lot more about what the determinants of this may be. And in SG Leads, I think one of the pre-publications pieces of work that have come out in one of the research briefs is an analysis of the mediating pathways between socioeconomic background and these early indicators of academic success. And what they find is that, not surprisingly, financial stresses, household values, and what I think is really very fascinating, the strength of the relationship of the child to the father, all influence the physical home environment, what's done in the home to develop the child, and the social emotional qualities that persist. Gusto, on the other hand, has actually also given rise to a very fascinating study that I, as a mom, am very well aware of. But that maternal mental health is actually a very strong predictor of these outcomes as well. And so putting these two studies together, what this tells us is that when we look at the material well-being of the family, financial stress, right, rather than necessarily the level of financial well-being, is actually what creates challenges for the household. If there is financial stress, that is a real issue that affects potentially the availability of parents and the mental health of parents as well, but also the social construct related to values, relationships, and potentially the ability of parents and parents together to function to provide that house, that foundation for the child are as important, or in fact, in some cases, probably more important than the absolute value of financial resources. Another very interesting study that we did pick up from the National Institute of Education looks at longitudinal data on students from 2004 to 2010. And this also tells us a little bit more about our understanding of how social status and class matter. And this study looked at the socio-economic index in a slightly different way. So it took mother's educational level. It also took whether or not people lived in the type of residence and SES resources. And here you can see this is very contextualized to Singapore, whether a family has a helper, a car, or a club membership. And what they found was that when we took this measure of SES and we tried to run it against aggregate PSLE scores in this cohort of students, this had a moderate effect, but other social factors that might be connected again to these broader aspects of SES also mattered. So language spoken at home, which we know is increasingly a proxy for having a transnational household, also have very large effects, as well as the materiality of the assets and resources that are available to the child. The other thing that I thought was really fascinating that emerged from this NIE study was that not only does your individual SES matter, but again, there are very strong positive associations between the class level of PSLE and class level SES, which suggests that peers also matter. So the SES of the environment that you then study in also influences your individual achievement indirectly. Right. So having, I think, understood that SES is multidimensional and all of these dimensions matter, what we also see at PSLE are that there are very clear implications that have broader social meaning. So when we look, for example, at, and this is data that we took from data.gov, this is one of the only pieces of data that show PSLE pass rates that are broken down again by social groups. And what you'll see here is that PSLE pass rates in mathematics that are broken down by ethnicity show very clear patterns and disparities around particular social demographic groups that may or may not be moving forward at the same rate. And so what you'll see is that PSLE pass rates for Chinese, and others, and the cohort as a whole, have remained very stable over the years, with the Indian demographics surging up, but that our children in the Malay community actually remain at significant disadvantage with this, with actually a decline in the middle 2007s, which, if you remember, again, is very strongly associated with what we had seen, the dip in SES the dip in performance for low SES students in the 2007s. Right? So there are broader social implications. We've also seen that actually this trend is actually a little bit more alarming again when we look at PSLE pass rates in English. Now, again, what you'll see here is that the absolute levels of pass are very high. So we're talking about pass rates around the 90% mark at minimum. But we do see that these trends for the Malay community, again, are diverging very strongly from the rest of the other ethnic groups. And so the extent to which SES explains some of this, or SES is correlated with, is very challenging for us to talk about, because we actually have very little access to disaggregated data. And that's something that I want to come back again to in our discussion about how to move this dialogue forward. We can see that these disparities are emerging in important ways that may or may not be correlated with SES, and that we know on higher level are related, but it's very challenging for us to unpack this without more information at a disaggregated level. Nonetheless, even though we are limited by the public information or publicly available data at an individual level, we can very clearly say that there are strong implications for our young people in the long term. If we return again to the information that was released by the Ministry of Education around PSLE, what we can see here is that the median student of the cohort, when we compare those PSLE scores to the cutoff of Express, what we will see is that the median student for the cohort will qualify for Express stream, but the median student in the FAS cohort will not. So even though this appears to be scores in continuum, these scores lie actually at a break-even point that will dictate to some degree divergence in paths and opportunities that have very long-term consequences for the lifetime and social mobility of these children. So a little bit can mean a lot. I'm going to pause and take a breath. So with this information, we do want to move on a little bit and talk about the global evidence review. The global evidence review, similar to what we wanted to do with the local evidence scan, was undertaken with a very pragmatic lens in place. And what we wanted to do was do something that would be rigorous and evidence-based, but at the same time be very relevant to the conditions on the ground. And we undertook this firstly by stepping back and saying, let's think about how actually we conceptualize interventions and outcomes before we start running after the data that we need, so that we make sure that we don't systematically review everything under the sun. And so, having gone through the literature on SES and on outcomes, we created this conceptual framework to think about the types of interventions that we wanted to focus our attention on. And so thinking about the components of SES that really seem to us to be emerging: parental education, occupation, household resources, family structure and relations, and cultural and social capital, we felt that these were the key inputs into how SES transforms our relationship to learning. So these inputs in our framework influence individual traits, household traits, community norms, and in some sense, the way that people interact with the education system, including, but not necessarily, only restricted to formal schooling. Within the education system, we know that certain aspects of the education system influence or supplement, either by substituting or complementing individual resources. The aspects of the elements of the education system that we thought seemed to emerge would be access to appropriate educational pathways, the quality of pedagogy or practice, or the way that they approach engagement with stakeholders of diverse backgrounds. And our understanding is that when we combine all of these things together in these various ways, what we see are three very important ways in which we think of learning. One being cognitive achievement, so test scores, but also social-emotional well-being and traits that, first of all, promote learning, but are the outcome of learning as well. So, for example, self-efficacy. And last but not least, school performance and social-emotional well-being at the end of the day lead to an asset of schooling attainment, such as completion. And so the three types of categories of interventions that might work in a framework like this would be, firstly, interventions that address the formal education system directly, or interventions from outside the socioeconomic system that target the drivers of socioeconomic status, so things that try to elevate households themselves or address those root factors within the household. And last but not least, interventions outside the education that try to help students directly to change their capacity, their beliefs, or resources related to learning. So these would be things that try to not necessarily change the welfare or income of households, not necessarily try to change the way that schools deliver education, but really work in that third space of interaction and try to change the way that our students or households actually are engaging with the education system. And that's where we felt we would focus our attention to try to understand where interventions in a space like this, which would be open to players that are not necessarily within the school system or within the social services system, where we could play a role. And so that was what we wanted to do with our review. So we did a rapid evidence review, and the goal here was to identify existing programs and components or interests outside the education that would aim to improve academic performance. That was our key goal when we began this project. It was a pragmatic review, and so we wanted to cut off the evidence base from 2014 forward, because if we want to go too far back, I want to make sure that we're still relevant, and to try to provide very concrete recommendations of where to go forward. These were our priorities. So what was our search strategy? We focused on primarily, as I mentioned again, on academic achievement or performance. The key target population would be students of primary school age from a socially disadvantaged background within high income or OECD countries. And that was very important for us because we wanted to examine the idea of disparity. So we excluded upfront studies of, for example, primary school children in low middle income countries with low resource systems, where at the end of the day, this wasn't a story about inequity, but about lack of resource. Our study timeframe was 20 years. And we began by doing a search of reviews. And so we focused on systematic reviews and meta-analysis in a number of the most commonly accepted journals for systematic reviews and meta-analysis in this space. We identified a key resource, Dietrichson et al., which is a systematic review, is fairly recently looking at academic interventions, and this gave us a taxonomy of interventions that we then used to conduct a second search. So we took that taxonomy of interventions and then we searched for those individual interventions as well in low SES students, looking for studies where the primary outcome was academic achievement. So we did, after having done a first cut for reviews, we did a second search for individual interventions. We then also looked for individual observational studies in the database of ERIC. ERIC is the Education Research Information Center, to look to see if we could fan search and find any individual interventions that might also fit our criteria. So for that, we ended up with 3 systematic reviews and 9 relevant observational studies that we extracted information on the primary outcome, as well as other outcomes and elements of our framework. I'm going to go very briefly through these horrible tables. Now I understand that they're very poorly formatted. This is nothing to do with it. This is entirely my fault. Adam made them beautifully and I transferred them to PowerPoint and ruined the aesthetic completely. So there's 3 types of intervention that we really focus our attention on. The first type of interventions are interventions that focus on supplementing in-school or other academic support. And what this means is interventions that try to address the gaps in learning resources directly. So tutoring, and then in varyingly decreasing levels of intensity, cooperative learning, where you have small groups of students that try to help one another, and then small group instruction, where you have intensive adult delivered instructions to a group of 2 to 5 students, which is a little bit more passive at the end of the day. And what we see here, not surprisingly, is that tutoring is extremely effective in all of our systematic reviews. There are some peer effects that come from cooperative learning or small group instruction that also seem to be effective, but most effective of all are highly structured one-on-one small group instruction. We then also looked at interventions that, instead of trying to substitute a supplement for educational resources, to enhance the way in which the students are engaging with educational resources. So one of the strategies that we found to be very effective was feedback and progress monitoring. So delivering systems that would actually deliver more timely information about student performance. And this is actually very complementary to a number of studies that we see in implementation science, where we find that training is not enough, but audit and feedback is actually one of the leading ways in which we improve performance, even among adults. And what we find here is that feedback and progress monitoring, individualized, timely information and feedback is very critical, very strong results. What we also saw is that computer-assisted instruction had a very wide range. So we found that in systematic reviews, overall, there were no strongly significant events, and this was partly because the variance of studies is very high. We found some very highly positive individual studies, but also some studies where nothing happened, or in some cases, even negative. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the negative effects sometimes of pushing out computer-assisted instruction to communities of students where they're not prepared, and that the digital divide can actually worsen. And so disparities may become even worse. So computer-assisted instruction, we found very mixed results. And then we also found some small effects on incentives, which are the idea of giving rewards and performance bonuses to students to motivate learning. And last but not least, we looked at non-academic or holistic support. And what that meant was that we looked at other types of programs that did not attempt to address academic performance directly, but to really give students that additional support to enable them to have the capacity to learn. And this would include out-of-school time programs, so academic or non-academic support that was delivered after school or over vacation or summer camp supports, coaching and mentoring, and parental engagement. And what we do see is that out-of-school time programs and coaching and mentoring have small effects on learning directly when measured in the short term, but we found in these studies and reviews a fair amount of support for the fact that actually at the end of the day, the key outcomes for these programs were to bolster social-emotional learning, and they did very well at doing that, which potentially has good long-term outcomes for the children as well. And so perhaps we're shining the light in the wrong place when looking at OST and coaching and mentoring. Last but not least, we look at parental engagement programs, and here, much like computer-assisted instruction, we see a wide range. While we saw many studies that acknowledge that parental engagement is the key factor for many of these children, we know what the problem is, but our reviews show us that our understanding of how to address it, however, is still lacking. So we know the problem, but not necessarily the solutions. We see that in the systematic reviews, again, because parental engagement programs are very diverse. They range from parenting, fairly intensive PPP style parent programs to simple parent trainings or meet the parent sessions. And so partly because of this, but also partly because this is a very difficult program, we see very mixed results. So in summary, what do we take away from this? We know what is proven to work is intensive supplementary instruction with a high degree of personalization and feedback. If there is a learning gap where a particular student has missed out on specific resources, giving those resources and addressing that gap directly is very effective, not a surprise. What we did also find surprisingly what works, but only in the short term, are incentives and rewards. So you can give a child a McDonald's voucher. This is what I received as growing up in Malaysia. It incentivizes you for a very short time and probably teaches you nothing about public health. But it works, but it doesn't build that intrinsic motivation. On the other hand, we know that what works to build that intrinsic motivation, but not in the short term, would be student coaching and out-of-school time programs that try to build these more holistic social-emotional skills. So this, conversely, don't give us the quick boost to scores, but potentially, actually quite robustly in some of these cases, will address other social cognitive competencies such as stress management, problem solving, empathy, decision making, all skills that will be needed for future success and complement or sometimes even substitute for academic excellence. And last but not least, I think what we really took away from this is that these two things we need to make work better and more consistently. So we need technology to work better and more consistently. We see, I think, anecdotally as well, that this is true. We see many technological solutions that work extremely well, but at the same time, we worry a lot that when we introduce this to students and systems that are not ready, not only do we not see effects, but we may see gaps increase. And similarly with parental engagement, like as I mentioned before, we know the problem. The problem is real. There are many studies that document the problem, but how best to engage parents when they don't have that bandwidth and resource is still an open question. And perhaps the combination of technological supports, parental engagement, and together at an area that we can explore in the near future. Alicia tells me I have 2 minutes left. Okay, so just moving right along to the local context. So what we did was take these results and findings and ask some of our local stakeholders how we might bring this back to the context of Singapore. And so in order to do this, what we did was do a number of informal, confidential informational interviews. And we did consultation from multiple sectors. We had senior officers from public sector agencies that were no longer or had retired or were not directly engaged anymore in these, so they felt able to speak with us. We had representatives of social sector agencies or NGOs that were working with children and families. We spoke to service designers who had been engaged in designing similar programs, and a few academics in the social science and education research sector. These discussions were conducted for about an hour, and we asked some questions and we got a lot of feedback, and we also had some feedback on questions that we didn't ask, which is what happens when you engage with academics. So what did we find? First of all, nobody found these results surprising. People said, oh, well, yes, this makes a lot of sense. We already knew this. Thank you very much. So this is very consistent, but I think people were very interested to see that the findings or the consolidation of the information was very consistent with their understanding on the ground. But it's actually very important for us to reflect that on the ground, there are key nuances relative to Singapore. And first of all, with respect to tutoring, this was widely accepted that tutoring is a fact of life in Singapore, and that even within this very proven intervention, there are a lot of nuances to consider, a lot of ground level differences in delivery. Tutoring, as one person said, has a range, and there's also, even though an intervention may be proven on the ground, in reality, they're very diverse, and this also varies by SES. Secondly, very widely endorsed that giving financial incentives to students might work in Singapore, but it was not likely to be desirable or something that would be feasible to do. And mentoring or befriending relationships was something that was brought up a lot, especially in the volunteer context, but people brought up a lot of the challenges as well, that this was something that was desirable, but can be very difficult. It can be very idiosyncratic, very hard to sustain in a volunteer population, and that trust-based relationships cannot simply come into existence out of nowhere. And so in order to make some of these other interventions work well, they have peer groups or rapport, these are things that also have to rely very strongly on pre-existing platforms or community affinities. Secondly, the real-world landscape is considerably more interlinked than what we see in terms of these clean interventions. So intervention approaches and mechanisms are not siloed. Most providers are offering programs that combine many of these approaches. And in fact, even while we talk about this, all of our practitioners emphasize that regardless of the fact that we're talking only about interventions by third parties, that the basic financial and non-financial economic support that comes from the financial assistance scheme is of critical value. Last but not least, I think everyone brought up the design and implementation on the ground will matter regardless of our theory of the evidence base. For these programs, regardless of what we're doing, long-term commitment is very critical. It's not always realized. It's very challenging to do, for example, especially with volunteers. Any intervention needs to be clearly embedded within the household. We have a very family-centric, community-centric approach, for example, to social care, and this is something that needs to be acknowledged and understood. It cannot be delivered in a standalone context. Most programs need a significant time to actually explain their goals and motivations, to get buy-in from all of the different stakeholders in a very crowded space. And that simply adding more programs is not necessarily a panacea, even if it is the best program, because the complexity of the local system is actually very, very high. And so there is a very strong trade-off between adding more and adding more complexity to families that already have difficulties navigating all of the resources that are available or not available to them. Some common strategic priorities that were mentioned. Stakeholders felt that it was actually very important on the ground actually to reach a common definition of SES, not only because of conceptual reasons, but also for operational clarity. And one of our stakeholders described how at the end of the day, when trying to reach at-risk young people, what would happen would be that your definition of socioeconomic status would drift depending on the partner that you were going to be working with, because different agencies would be serving different communities. And so your definition, rather than having an operational strategic clarity, would actually sort of start to vary on the ground depending on who your partner was and how they defined households at risk. And that might mean, again, that your population, in fact, was very contingent on who you were working with, rather than having a uniform approach. The second, I think, really interesting and an important common thread was that people began to sort of tell us that we needed to develop an understanding of need that was more nuanced than the SES lens. And firstly, just taking an SES lens was very narrow. It was important to think not just about levels of need, but volatility and instability in many of these households that might be doing very well today, but not well tomorrow, and might be bouncing from place to place, particularly in uncertain times. And most importantly, that SES is not a gradient necessarily. And that actually, as one person said, at the bottom of the income spectrum, there actually are very many social supports. But in fact, vulnerability actually also accrues to households and children that are in the lower middle income group that may be falling through a social support net that suddenly becomes less supportive without having the level of dedication and resource of the high income households. And so vulnerability is really not as sharp of a gradient as we might imagine, but really actually is more nuanced and diffuse across the income spectrum. The third thing, which was actually highlighted by multiple stakeholders actually, was that it's actually very important when we think about it and consistent with what we find in our global evidence review to focus ourselves not only on academic achievement, but more holistic objectives. And as one stakeholder said, this is the direction that the whole education system itself is going towards. And so the efforts that we see locally are focused on a new and more holistic vision of local education. And it behooves us, as we're thinking about interventions, to also try to work towards this vision as well. And overemphasizing academic results, even though that is something that we want to be very pragmatic about, could actually perpetuate some of these existing systemic biases and actually perpetuate this inappropriate focus on test scores as well. So we want to be very careful with that balance. And last but not least, I think we received, a very good caution, which is to be very aware that we need to go needs first and not solution first. And that barriers to participation and parents' ability or desire to participate and to sustain that participation needs to be first order. And we need to go for it from a family and child-centric perspective. And on the ground, even the most well-designed of programs in the wrong context or with the wrong fit, in theory, may be great, but recruitment and maintenance are challenging, even though needs are high, bandwidths are limited. And one of the things that we do need to consider again is potentially streamlining the existing system instead of adding more programs, or to make things work better rather than adding more to the burden of parents who really don't have the space to participate to begin with. When we talk about bringing the dialogue forward, there were three things that we identified. One is that data insights need to be more accessible to practitioners. And when we spoke to practitioners and policymakers and service designers, everyone is supportive of taking an evidence-based approach to design and implementation. But a major constraint is access to data that they can use for those insights and the capacity to collect that data or the skill to analyze that data, which is related to the second thing, building stronger evaluation capacity. Almost every stakeholder that we spoke to was engaged in efforts related to research and evaluation, albeit at varying stages. Everyone recognizes as a gap that we are trying to close. Very few of those individuals on the ground actually are ironically collecting the kind of information systematically that would allow us to do the kind of studies that we need to generate these insights. So very stringent intake or graduation measures that again are consistent across definitions of SES are limited, but also the kind of longitudinal tracking of academic performance or even these broader measures of holistic education and learning are again very much a rarity. Last but not least, I think our stakeholders also pointed out that what's actually important is to have a space and platform to work collaboratively as well as the mandate to do so. And there's a very strong recognition that not everyone should be doing everything in the space and that different stakeholders have different roles to play. And one of the things that we can do in the non-governmental sector is to focus on gaps in existing programs, or maybe work with public sector to scale programs, or focus on niche programs or tailored programs where we can add value rather than trying to reinvent the wheel or worse, in fact, making it confusing for the people on the ground while wasting efforts, actually maybe perhaps even going backwards or discouraging or increasing complexity in a system that may be already very hard for parents to grapple with. So in summary, thank you. Even with the limited information we have on the ground, clearly socioeconomic status in all of its complexity matters in Singapore. We see this no matter how many different ways we try to cut socioeconomic status. There is a lot that international practice can tell us, a lot of which we already sort of instinctively knew, really, but that it includes both immediate, targeted, highly personalized learning support. So we address the problem where we see it, but also the problem before we see it, longer-term efforts that support more holistic SEL development. But what is critical is that this needs to be adapted to our local needs and our local system. So in order for these solutions to work, we need vision, but we also need realistic expectations. We need individual level access and feasibility to work. We need organizations to understand these implementation factors, and we need the system level coordination because we have so few resources in this space. Duplication or wastage is actually not a luxury that we can afford. And actually, what we are seeing as well from the ground is that sustainability, commitment, being able to go the distance, both in terms of program intervention, but also data collection and discussion are really key. And so with that, I think that's the wrap up of our report. We do have other results to share, so please feel free to reach out if you have questions or would like to learn a little bit more about the specific pillars of the study or any of our original data analysis. I'm very happy to turn this back to Felicia. Thank you again to Octava Foundation and to Columba Design, our partners, for being part of this process. Any mistakes are mine and mine alone. Thank you very much, Felicia. Back to you.